Welcome to Civility and American Democracy, a national forum. Presented by the Center for Civil Discourse at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. In partnership with Mass Humanities, WBUR Radio, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Moderating today's discussion, the host of WBUR's On Point, Tom Ashbrook.
Good morning. Welcome to a day-long discourse on civility and American democracy, civil discourse. We all know how absent it can be in our lives today. We all occasionally long for it. We all occasionally lapse in it ourselves. We're going to have a tremendous day today of thinking and sharing about this very important subject for our country, for our democracy. And we're very glad for the audience here in the hall with us in Boston, and for all of you joining us from around the country. Welcome. We're very glad that you're here. A few thoughts. Let's acknowledge right off the bat that there are things that are more important, fundamentally important, than civil discourse, than civility, like justice or, say, compassion. If you're trying to lynch me, I don't care how civil you are, how polite, how well-rounded your discourse. If I'm trying to lynch you, you will no doubt feel the same. To hell with civility, with civil discourse. And yet, we cannot always just go for one another's jugular. As a nation, we are a large organism. To move forward or just to stay healthy, there are a lot of things that need to go on. In the human body, cells that only attack and disrupt are called cancer. Now, maybe civil discourse is the emollient, the oil can that lets gears mesh and work in a democracy, that lets us apply our minds and the better angels of our nature, not just our passions and our unvarnished narrow interests, to our conflicts, our points of disagreement. But passions matter too. My hope would be with vigorous civil discourse, spirited, intense, honest, we may learn from our conflicts, even see our republic strengthened, our understanding of one another deepened, our union made of such diversity, made more intimately bound. But we cannot be naive, and if we do not really understand these dynamics, all that is just talk. We are not looking here today for empty suit civil discourse. So today we dive in with great thinkers here in this hall and around the country. Our first session today is on civility in American history. The questions: is civility really as American as apple pie? And what about American individualism and self-expression? The Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement. Is incivility an inescapable element of American-style democracy? Can civility accommodate political change and facilitate social progress? This panel raises fundamental questions about civility and American democracy in history. Let me introduce our guest today. From my far right, John Stauffer is Professor of English and African American Studies at Harvard University. Please welcome John Stauffer. Randall Kennedy is Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. Randall Kennedy. And Jill Lepore, Professor of American History at Harvard. Jill. Our format is as follows. Each of the three will take the podium for a few minutes, give us the gist of their insight on this subject today. We'll have a quick back and forth. Then the four of us will hold a discussion about what's been put on the table by these three, and then we will open this conversation to all of you here in the hall and around the country. So as we're talking, as I'm sure you will, be thinking. Your questions will be welcome. John Stauffer, we give the floor to you.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here. Good morning. As many of you know, roughly 50% of Americans believe there's been a profound lack of civility in current public discourse, especially in political debates. And I agree with the recent decline in civility over the past 10 years or so. But I want to take a long view and explore how civility has evolved from really the antebellum period to the near present. Over the past 200 years or so, civility has increased dramatically. And one of the reasons for that is that for in the 19th century and for centuries, civility was always defined in part in terms of its opposite, and that is civility, the state of being civilized, of engaging in civilized discourse, was seen as opposite of barbarism or being barbaric. And because of that binary between civility or civilization and barbarism, there was a tendency to use violent means or savage means as a way to restore or to affirm civility. The one main reason for the change, for the decline of the resort to violence has been that binary between civility and barbarism broke down roughly in the second half of the 20th century. When public discourse threatens the existing social order, though, those in power often call it uncivil. And in American history, there's been a long tradition of the subalterns, those without power, those without a public voice, blacks, women, Indians, radicals, agitating for public voice, hoping to use their words as a spur to reform, and those in power wanting to silence it, and silencing it by saying that's uncivil. And so, especially during periods of profound ideological strife and political strife, that sphere of what is considered acceptable forms of civil discourse needs to be allowed to expand, to accommodate these widely divergent views without that language devolving into violence. Let me give you 3 examples, and let's see. Oh, here's the first one. So the first one is one of the most memorable acts of from the perspective of us today and from the perspective of Northerners in the 1850s of uncivil behavior in Congress. Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, one of the most abolitionist congressmen at the time, was caned almost to death on the Senate floor in 1856. It was a period in which there was literally civil war, not only in the Senate, but in Kansas. The provocation for this caning was Sumner's speech, The Crime Against Kansas. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened northern territories to slavery, which leads to civil war in Kansas. And in Sumner's speech in The Crime Against Kansas, he targets the architects of this Kansas-Nebraska Act, particularly Andrew Butler, who is the senator of South Carolina. And Sumner considered slavery barbaric for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that Sumner understood slavery as barbaric because of the fact that it led to polygamy. It led masters to have sex with their slaves, and so they had multiple, so-called wives or women. And Sumner wanted to convey this barbarism in his Crime Against Kansas speech. There was actually a law in the Senate in which a senator could not accuse other senators of sexual improprieties. So strictly speaking, he adhered to the rules of the Senate, but he used sexuality as metaphor. He says that Andrew Butler, Senator Butler of South Carolina, is in love with the harlot slavery. And that's one example. And Butler's kinsman, fellow South Carolinian Preston Brooks, felt that he and his state had been dishonored, which was a form of incivility, felt that the proper response to this dishonor was not a duel, which Southerners still thought, but a horsewhipping, the way you treat a slave. So he walks into the Senate after it had adjourned, and Sumner's at his desk writing, and he almost kills him on the Senate floor. Now, what's significant here is that Northerners were absolutely outraged. It actually fueled the rise of the Republican Party. But Southerners considered Preston Brooks to be civil. Southerners showered Preston Brooks with congratulatory canes and silver platters. To this day, there are cities and counties named after Preston Brooks in South Carolina. So there was a profound disagreement over what constituted civility and over the means to affirm it. So moving forward, roughly 100 years later, this is a photograph from the journalist Charles Moore, who covered the civil rights movement for Life magazine. The context is the integration of University of Mississippi, and Governor Ross Barnett defying the federal court order trying to prevent James Meredith from enrolling. John F. Kennedy sent in National Guard. A riot ensued. Each side, though, displayed, especially in contrast with Sumner and Brooks and slave owners and anti-slave owners, each side, not only in Oxford, Mississippi, but in general in civil rights, displayed, especially among the leaders, surprising willingness to negotiate. Barnett enabled Kennedy to enroll Meredith without an overwhelming display of federal power, and Kennedy was uncomfortable with an overwhelming display of federal power. And Kennedy allowed Barnett to save face as a Southern segregationist to his constituents while facilitating integration in his negotiations with Kennedy. This image is unlike the one from 100 years earlier, in which white Southerners would have seen that image and said, well, of course that Preston Brooks caned Sumner. It's legitimate. This image becomes an important tool in the civil rights movement. Southerners, segregationists, hated the fact that photographers were covering the movement. They didn't want these images circulated, which essentially reflects the idea that you're using violence to silence agitators was no longer acceptable. The fact that you use violence as a way to destroy or to silence your enemy's barbarism and preserve civility is now unacceptable. The third example you're all probably familiar with is Joe Wilson's "You Lie" and Obama's 2009 congressional speech supporting health care. In the speech, Obama denied that the health care bill would insure illegal immigrants, and immediately Wilson stands up, says, "You lie," and after the same day, Wilson apologized publicly. He told his fellow Republicans that his outburst was totally disrespectful. He agreed that he had breached the boundaries of civility. He emphasized his faith in civility. Then what happens is he receives $2 million in campaign contributions, and he kind of backs off his apology. But again, in terms of over the course of 150 years or so, this reflects a considerable advance in our understanding of that sphere of civility and what's considered acceptable, what's considered unacceptable. Many people, particularly liberals, in the past couple years, many liberals, you're probably familiar with this image of Sarah Palin's crosshair poster, that this was totally uncivil. I don't see it as uncivil. It's in poor taste, but taste is distinct from civility. They're not the same thing. And in a sense, Palin, Wilson, they are seen as, by liberals, as the outsiders who are demanding a voice and seeking to take over a kind of long-standing liberal establishment. And so liberals have tended to accuse them of being uncivil. Here's another image. This is from a fringe website. It's a deeply disturbing image. It's a racist image in which Obama's raping the Statue of Liberty. But it's a long way from Southerners wielding billy clubs. And two more. This is a SNCC lynching photograph, and this is an example of civil rights activists reappropriating a tool of the enemy. And in doing so, it affirms civility, protesting the barbarism of white supremacists. Again, it reflects that the breakdown of language of dissent into violence is no longer acceptable. One other image, and then I'll stop. This is one of the most shocking photographs I've ever seen. I teach it on numerous occasions. It's a horrifying image. It's a nothing if not uncivil. It's from 1968 in Saigon during the kind of climax of Vietnam when our ally, the head of intelligence, General Luan, executes a North Vietnamese prisoner in civilian clothes in the streets of Saigon. It ran on the front page of virtually every newspaper and on film. In fact, NBC trimmed 17 seconds for reasons of taste when they showed it. You're probably familiar with the image. It's, as I said, nothing if not uncivil. And yet this image bore witness to the atrocities, to the profoundly uncivil aspects of war. And this image coincided with the largest shift in public opinion polling ever recorded in war. A month before the image, 65% of Americans polled were hawks, 35% were doves. A month after the image, that reversed itself.
I'm the uncivil type.
Okay.
Forgive me.
Okay.
A question, and we'll come back to this. If Americans have become so much more civil over this couple of hundred years, why do you think, in brief, we'll come back to it, there's so much concern today about incivility in our public discourse? Are we just wimps today?
Why is there so much concern? I think there's concern because, for a number of reasons. One is our understanding of what's acceptable and unacceptable for civility has increased over the past 100 years. I think there's also many Americans don't appreciate the degree to which we are experiencing, in my view, a profoundly ideological and political strife and almost warfare. I mean, if you look at the Republicans versus liberal Democrats, the gap between them is huge. Many Republicans, in a sense, their vision of the good society, their vision of civilized society, they want to take us back to Teddy Roosevelt. They want to strip away most of the New Deal. And that's their vision.
It's hard to straddle
that gulf. The gulf is huge. And with the greater the gulf, the more one needs to broaden that sphere of civility.
There's a challenging view from history already. John Stauffer, thank you very much. Randall Kennedy, please.
Thank you very much. Whenever I hear unqualified denunciations of incivility, derision of people who refuse to compromise, criticism of extremists, and annoyance with radicals, I think of certain figures who are among those I most admire. In particular, I think of William Lloyd Garrison, who lived between 1805 and 1879, the remarkable editor of The Liberator, who condemned Negro slavery as a sin and demanded its immediate abolition when most white Americans considered such views as either wildly utopian or viciously misguided. Garrison conducted himself in a fashion that many contemporaries and historians have condemned as highly uncivil. At the end of speeches, he put a match to copies of the United States Constitution to dramatize his abhorrence of its compromise with enslavement. He damned the Constitution as a covenant with death and an agreement with hell. He vilified enemies of abolitionism. When Daniel Webster supported the Compromise of 1850, Garrison called the Massachusetts senator a lickspittle of the slave-holding oligarchy. Although Garrison was and remains controversial, he is, in my view, one of the greats of American history. I admire his far-sighted detestation of slavery and negrophobia, and admire, too, his willingness to offend deliberately the sensibilities of his contemporaries to make his point. an argument for the sanctity of human liberty that he pressed fearlessly, ruthlessly, and dogmatically, with commendable disregard for the ascendant conventions that constituted civility in his era. Some charge that Garrison's punitive, intransigent, uncompromising style is a violation of proper democratic morality. In particular, detractors abhor his rejection of compromise. In their view, to quote the president of the University of Pennsylvania, Amy Gutmann, compromise is the soul of democracy. And so they don't like Garrison's attack on compromise, at least with respect to the issue of slavery. President Obama, too, valorizes compromise, and he does so sounding very much like Professor Amy Gutmann. He has recently condemned his political adversaries' disinclination to compromise as a political sin at variance with valuable traditions. This country was founded on compromise, says our president. I couldn't go through the front door at this country's founding, he has remarked. And if we were really thinking about ideal positions, we wouldn't have had a union. He's explicitly referring to the compromise on slavery that made possible union. Are Gutmann and Obama saying that willingness to compromise, to accommodate, to bargain is always better than inflexibility? I doubt it. Gutmann, after all, asserts that with respect to certain sorts of disagreements, citizens do not have any obligation of mutual respect toward their opponents. She gives as an example of a position unworthy of any respect or reciprocity, a policy to legalize discrimination against blacks and women. I suppose that President Obama, too, would embrace the proposition that there are some matters regarding which there is no obligation to compromise or be civil. He is, after all, the commander-in-chief of the most powerful armed forces in the world. He has, after all, ordered the killing of specified individuals. And in The Audacity of Hope, his 2008 campaign manifesto, he acknowledged that it has not always been the pragmatist, the voice of reason, or the force of compromise that has created the conditions for liberty. He observed that it was unbending idealists like William Lloyd Garrison, Denmark Vesey, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, who recognized that power would concede nothing without a fight. Other civilitarians probably share these sentiments. When they champion civility, they are probably doing so with the expectation of an implicit consensus on fundamentals so that disagreement will be within certain bounds. Line drawing, unsurprisingly, however, breeds real difficulties. When is civility required? When is it not required? When would it be immoral to be civil? Well, some students of this subject have suggested a sort of social consensus boundary. Within the boundary of reasonable disagreement, every viewpoint should be dealt with civility. And so there's some controversies that are seen to be within the bounds of reasonable disagreement. I think the most politically important of those disagreements in today's America would probably be the issue of abortion. On the other hand, there are some disagreements which are viewed as outside of reasonable bounds. Some positions that are outside of the pale. So someone advancing the proposition that slavery is a positive good, that would be viewed as outside of the bounds of reasonable disagreement. To quote one participant in these debates, Professor Robert George of Princeton, Professor George has suggested that civility should govern moral debate whenever cultural circumstances or other factors make it possible for reasonable people of goodwill to be mistaken about a putative moral evil. And reasonable people can be mistaken about even serious moral evils when ignorance, prejudice, self-interest, and other factors that impair sound moral judgment are prevalent in a culture or subculture. I disagree with that position. First, at least with respect to ideologies that develop a large following, for example, white supremacism, Nazism, Stalinism, cultural circumstances or other factors will usually make it possible for reasonable people of goodwill to be mistaken about a putative moral evil. A second and more important objection is that George and other civilitarians overlook the role that incivilities have played in moving American political culture in a good direction. Moral progress does not just happen. It is made to happen in all sorts of ways, including conduct that is tainted with coercion. Think of any strike or boycott, or aggressiveness. Think of the punitive anti-slavery polemics of my hero, William Lloyd Garrison, or out-and-out violence. Think of John Brown, think of Nat Turner, think of Denmark Vesey, or for that matter, think of Abraham Lincoln's Union Army. Civility can be a virtue. I am willing to say that it is presumptively a virtue. I do not want to be seen as cavalierly dismissing civility and its attendant habits, customs, and sentiments. It is surely worthwhile to investigate ways of minimizing discord, to caution against needless polarization, to encourage self-control, and to praise modesty, considerateness, and the inclination to give others the benefit of the doubt. Still, in a cruel world, all too filled with injustice, civility should be viewed realistically and put in its rightful, limited place. Thank you.
Randall Kennedy. A question then, Randall. How do we keep from going too quickly to arms when large moral issues can be seen in daily lives? How do we keep open a ground for civil conversation before we're on a path to civil conflict, civil war?
Well, I mean, a variety of things. One, we have to keep in mind the terrible consequences of too quickly going too far. Violence is sometimes necessary, but of course violence is also very terrible, and we have to keep that in mind as we seek to push our own individual points of view.
We're a long way from a minuet in this view of the world. The sort of option is always there on the table, and the fear of us going there is part then of what would restrain earlier in the conversation. Randall Kennedy, thank you very much. Randall Kennedy. Jill Lepore, please.
Thanks very much. It's been kind of a standing joke in my house all week that I'm participating in a forum on civility this week. I'm Italian, and we yell, so I'm going to try hard not to yell. But what I wanted to do to begin was to speak out largely in the spirit with which Tom Ashbrook made his framing remarks today, some other words other than civility that embody humanistic values that we, I think, would do well to dedicate ourselves to in more than a day-long session. Inquiry, tolerance, dissent, sympathy, equality, integrity, generosity, and argument. What I want to do today is to revisit one of the more well-known arguments about incivility in American history. And I'm going to take you back to 1963, November of 1963, when Richard Hofstadter, a 47-year-old historian from Columbia, delivered a lecture at Oxford. He called his lecture "The Paranoid Style of American Politics," and in it, he offered a sweeping interpretation of American political history. American politics, Hofstadter argued, is characterized by a paranoid style. He believed that Americans talk paranoid and think paranoid, using the language of what he called heated exaggeration, suspiciousness, and conspiratorial fantasy to describe dark goings-on by unnamed, mysterious plotters who lurk, disguised as honorable public servants within the very halls of government. Days after Hofstadter made this speech, John F. Kennedy was shot in Dallas. And somehow, that tragedy gained for Hofstadter's account of angry minds, the angry minds of Americans, a special hold on the national psyche. Many of you will have read Hofstadter's essay, I'm sure. It was published in Harper's right after he gave it. It was published the next year as the title essay in a book that has been reprinted year after year after year and every presidential election season since. It's still in print, it's all over the internet, and it has been used for a very long time to explain a great deal about how our politics is lived. It's been used to explain everything from Joseph McCarthy on the floor of Congress, stirring up fears of communist infiltrators in post-war Washington, to Glenn Beck on Fox Television, warning of eugenicists in Barack Obama's White House. All of these people, according to Hofstadter's argument, believe in a vast and sinister conspiracy, a gigantic yet subtle machinery of influence set in motion to destroy and undermine a way of life. Hofstadter was right about very many things, but when he delivered that lecture in 1963, he could not possibly have seen that the ground was shifting beneath his feet, and a chasm forming, and a whole new fury growing in America, not over a way of life, but over life itself. In 1965, Hofstadter fell ill. He would never recover. That year, 1965, marked the beginning of what we might think of as the age of life in American politics. On March 29, 1965, the Supreme Court began hearing arguments in Griswold v. Connecticut, the case whose ruling would make birth control legal based on a constitutional right to privacy. And on April 30th, a pink fetus appeared on the cover of Life magazine, curled up inside a white diaphanous membrane set against a black background flecked with what looked to be clusters of stars. A tiny human being floated in space, as if traveling the Milky Way in a ship the shape of an egg. Unprecedented photographic feat in color, the magazine boasted, promising to reveal for the first time the drama of life before birth. Inside, a 7-page spread, complete with a centerfold, documented the stages in the growth of the human embryo. Highly magnified color close-ups taken by Swedish photographer Lennart Nilsson. Said one gynecologist quoted in the magazine, "This is like the first look at the backside of the moon." No women were pictured. It was as if embryos grow in outer space. Before long, Nilsson's haunting and beautiful photographs came to stand for humanity itself. NASA launched Nilsson's portfolio into outer space on board the Voyager as evidence of life on Earth. The day Life published these photographs, Time, its sister magazine, reproduced the cover inside its own pages to illustrate a story called The Unborn Plaintiff, about the rights of fetuses in criminal court cases. The rights of women were not discussed. Although these photographs were purported to reveal the drama of life before birth, these fetuses and embryos pictured in Life magazine were dead. As the fine print explained, they had all been surgically removed. They, including the fetus on the cover, were the products of hysterectomies, abortions, and miscarriages. Billed as portraits of life and celebrated iconically as such ever since, Nilsson's photographs were, in fact, portraits of death. The baby boom ended in 1965, but the agony over embryos was just beginning. In 1968, Pope Paul VI issued On Human Life, affirming the sanctity of life from conception. The same year, Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King were assassinated. And in that decade, death in America moved from the home to the hospital. More Americans died in hospitals than ever before, and for the first time ever, a majority of Americans died in hospitals rather than at home. In that decade, Americans became obsessed with death. 1,200 books about death had been published between 1935 and 68. 1,200 more were published between 1968 and 73 alone. Publishers Weekly announced, "Death is now selling books." In May of 1960, the National Guard shot into a crowd of students at Kent State, occasioning a forum very much like the one we are participating in today. Newsweek asked 6 historians, including Hofstadter, who was by now dying of leukemia, although no one knew this but himself and his family, one question. Not what is the meaning of civility, but what ails the American spirit? Hofstadter's answer was bleakest. Kent State had left him despairing, and he was concerned that in an increasingly secular age, and this is the hallmark of his insight at that moment in 1970, is the rise of secularism, young people on both the right and the left, and maybe even especially on the left at that moment, were bringing a religious zeal into politics. Hofstadter said, "This is, I think, a dangerous way of thinking, because when you try to get existential values out of politics, which has to do with wholly different things, you're heading for an increase in fanaticism." 4 months later, Hofstadter was dead. These are existential questions. When does life begin? What happens when you're dead? Politics cannot answer them, and yet our politics is consumed by them. Since the 1960s, during decades when definitions of life and death have been the subject of both medical debate and shifting technological intervention, American politics, animated by an intractable, painful, and now entirely partisan fight over the beginning and the end of life, has been haunted by the specter of death. We can retrace some of those events. In 1972, the phrase sanctity of life for the first time appeared in an opinion of the Supreme Court. The next year, the court issued its ruling in Roe. In 1975, in the Karen and Quinlan case, the right to death and the right to die and the right to life were locked together. We can think about how that has worked in recent politics, of course. All of us have witnessed this during the debate over the Obama health care legislation. The summer Obama proposed that health care reform, Sarah Palin warned that health care would lead to death panels, and Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley agreed that citizens had every right to fear that the government was attempting to pull the plug on grandma. In Washington, street theater activists wore masks inspired by the scream. Just how much our political discourse now concerns matters of life and death can also be illustrated by the more recent fury over Planned Parenthood, which has required presidential nominees to testify their fealty to certain lobbies, which has tied up legislatures and courts in more than half a dozen states, launched a congressional investigation, and nearly led to the shutdown of the federal government, and all this in a single year, 2011 alone. Matters of life and death are not inherently partisan. In the decades since 1965, they have been made so, and here's the crux of the problem. Matters of life and death do not generally have two and only two sides. But we have two and only two parties. Reasonable people on all sides agree that profoundly serious, important, and difficult questions lie at the heart of these matters, but politics cannot answer them, and reasonable people, it appears, do not run political parties. In American politics, life and death are what we're talking about, even when we seem to be talking about something else. And that is why do or die is how we seem so often lately to be talking. Depressingly, not a few interlocutors in these debates give every appearance of insincerity, taking strident positions, but not feeling much of anything, practicing what we might think of as a zombie politics. Thank you.
Jill Lepore. Zombie politics. Jill, let me ask you then, and we'll come to this in just a moment. In fact, come on back, sit down. We're all going to talk here. Are you saying that the issues that we are so concerned about today that lead to this concern about a lack of incivility in our time against the scrim of American history are different in kind, in quality from the issues that Americans faced before?
I do think they are different in kind and quality. I mean, I think you can look at the course taking sort of John's long view of American history and think about many different rights struggles we have had over the course of American history. And in a way, they kind of neatly map onto the Jeffersonian life, liberty, and property triad, right? So if we think about the 18th century struggle for independence as a struggle over liberty, the key word of the 18th century was liberty. The key word of the 19th century for these 19th century struggles was property. We have a property in ourselves was the argument of slaves and fugitive slaves and abolitionists. We have a property in people was the argument of Southerners. Our argument today is largely about life. And
but what about inequality? What about corruption of the American political system, or militarism and war, or for that matter, incarceration rates? I mean,
sure. I'm not offering a total explanation. I'm offering, I'm sort of
something at the
throwing
heart of
something
it.
out for the sake of provocation. We're trying to have a discussion here. I would be delighted if people were to disagree with my interpretation, but what I'm proposing is I'm asking us to wonder whether, when we seem to be arguing about other things, we are actually arguing about sort of existential matters that really can't be worked out in a political sphere.
Let's dive on in here. And I should say for our audience here in Boston and around the country, in just a few minutes, we'll begin to take your questions, your comments on Twitter or Facebook or email. So give them to us now, or be ready to take the floor here or at our webcam locations around the country. We'll be happy to include you in this conversation. I think Americans are desperate to know. These are three really interesting takes on civility and its opposite in American history, when it's necessary, when it's not, when we've had it, when we haven't. But this question of where we stand today against, in contrast, or in the context of our history is so much on people's minds. We have a sense of being at some precipice, at a kind of potential breaking point, someplace we haven't been before, or if we've been there, to your point, John, you know, it can feel like the brink of war sometimes. So I'd like to hear each of you speak to your sense of how civil or incivil we are now, the quality of our national conversation now, and is it well within the ambit of where we've been before, or are we out in new territory? Why do we have this sense of being so perhaps even undone? Randall?
I think we have this sense because we don't have a good sense of our history. I do not think that we are in an especially, that we're in uncharted territory. The sort of civility crises come up periodically. 15 years ago, people were talking about a civility crisis. We live in a big, rambunctious democracy in which there is going to be conflict. And I think we should accept that there is going to be conflict and, frankly, accommodate ourselves to the workings out of conflict. Sometimes, by the way, the conflict will be very ugly, and indeed, sometimes the conflict will involve violence. There's been a lot of violence in American political life, and so I don't think that we should be under the delusion that we're actually sort of in uncharted territory.
John, you said we are in a period of profound strife, almost warfare. Now, perhaps you mean political warfare, but when you put it that way, we're looking a little further. So is this the steady state of American civil life, always at this point of feeling we're about to explode?
Yeah, I didn't mean to suggest that we're near civil war at all. Certainly political and ideological strife vis-a-vis the past 20, 30 years. A number of scholars and pundits have likened our current moment to 1860, to the eve of the Civil War, which I disagree with. I think the difference is profound for a number of reasons. I agree with Randy, violence is necessary. The difference is that there's a far greater respect for the evil of violence today than there was 100 years ago, 150 years ago. And I completely agree with Randy, too, about Americans having lost their sense of history, but not only that, their sense of literacy and their critical ability to understand and to engage discourse. According to literacy polls, people's reading and communication skills have dropped fairly dramatically. There's a major poll or exam done and study done in 2000, and our ability to critically engage language literacy is central to civility and democracy. They both depend upon it, and And that is, it's also central for our understanding of the past, for our understanding of the history.
What about that piece, Jill? If we're a country where, in some sense, the gun is always on the table, and Randall says maybe it should be. When you come to profound moral issues, you need to be ready to stand up and, at some point, even be extreme. But is it possible that we've lost some of the lattice work of literacy, of awareness of history, of humdrum civility that allows the conversation to be richer, sort of earlier on the path, that we slide in emotionality too quickly to a sense of conflict before we've really, in an informed way, talked these issues through?
Well, I guess I would say, one of the reasons I brought up that Kent State moment was we always have these conversations. We have these conversations every few years. And indeed, the answer that Daniel Boorstin gave when these 6 historians were asked what ails the American spirit in 1970 was we have lost our sense of history. We have always lost our sense of history. That is indeed the case. So we are inclined to panic. I think with regard to the question of is our political conversation less civil than it is in the past is actually the wrong question, because our political conversation is completely different. That is to say, more of our conversation is public, not more is uncivil. In other words, think about what it meant to publish an idea, say in 1950. That was to go through television, radio, magazine, or newspaper, or in a book. Every one of those mediums was scripted and edited. And it was a very small number of people who were participating in that conversation. But you would think about published speeches on the floor of legislative bodies, maybe we could add political speech. All those things go through a scripted and edited process. When we think about now, that constitutes the whole body of the political conversation, right? It's going to be a very different conversation than the conversation we have now. We're looking here at the screen of Twitter, Facebook, email. All these things are archived and are made public. I would, 99% of what we think or say is, in a sense, published now. So it looks a lot more uncivil, but that's because there is more of it. We have not talked anything about the expansion of the franchise. We're looking at a very different democracy and a very different body politic in 2012 than in 1860 or in 1790. We're looking at very different political actors and a different kind of political speech. So we would need to have some much more complicated metrics if we really wanted to substantiate the claim that something was fundamentally different now. Which is not to deny people's sense that there's something really yucky going on, right? That's palpable. But any kind of testable metric, that's a completely different question.
Let's try and pull up that yucky thing. What is it then that's going on compared to history, Randall, that leaves us with this discomfort today?
Well, I might be a bad person to ask this because, frankly, I think...
You want more ruckus?
Well, on certain things, yes. I want more ruckus on the fact that we have a scandalous problem of impoverishment in the United States, which our politicians don't talk about. So, yeah, I would like a lot more ruckus about that. But periodically, again, we have this talk of, sort of the civility crisis, and I don't. There is an aspect of this where I don't see a there. We have conflict. Conflict takes place in a variety of ways. And with respect to certain issues, you're right. That's right. The gun is on the table. And with respect to certain issues, we have profound conflict. I think it's all to the good that we think about, how can we get through profound conflict, avoiding the worst, but we have to accommodate ourselves, it seems to me, with the reality of profound conflict in a pluralistic society.
Is it possible, John, that we're having this feeling because too much is bottled up, that we have this enormous world of the web and everywhere else where everything can be thrown out, but that our deepest issues are not being confronted, and therefore this sense of angst?
I think that's part of it. As I mentioned, though, I think a lot of it has to do with the expansion of voices within the public sphere and the political discourse. And throughout American history, the more people clamoring for a political voice and for rights, the greater the accusations are of incivility. So I think that that's an important strand. And as Jill said, with the internet, I mean, people have the capacity for participating in the public sphere today, except for the prisoners. I mean, that's another
large population
that politicians are doing nothing about. But I think that we have a far greater opportunity for individuals to participate in the public sphere and in the political discourse, and that leads to a messiness. It leads to a kind of messy, difficult public environment.
You described the gap just between the parties, and there are others who would say the gaps are far wider than between the two major parties. But even with that gap, and I've been in the room with Rick Santorum saying, and other candidates, if we don't elect a new president this year, the American experiment, America as you've known it, will be gone, will be finished. That suggests a kind of existential canyon. Okay, what does American history tell us about how moments like that, where there are senses, there's a sense of a great, great canyon, how do those get resolved? Do they just, they rise and then they fritter away? Are they resolved through emphatic discourse where people dig in and really think it through together, or is it always through, I don't know, brute force, conflict, ballot box, head to head?
I think that's a great question. I would say the short answer is that it depends on specific context. I think, though in the long scheme, to use Randy's metaphor, in a sense, in the 19th century and from the Constitution through the early 20th century, the gun was on the table and always loaded. So picking up the gun and shooting it did not require much thought, and it didn't require much action. I'd like to think today that the gun is in the drawer and unloaded and hard to access, because in order to do so and to load it, it requires considerable thought, contemplation, and effort.
And Randall, sorry, Jill, I'll come to you.
Well, one thing that comes out in the civility discussion often is people go to, golden ageism. Mm-hmm. So there's this constant, there's the decline of civility, the decline in our politics. Decline, there are more people participating in politics. We have new figures. I mean, when in American life would anybody have ever thought of somebody like Barack Obama occupying the White House? We have women in positions of authority. In many respects, I'm very distrustful of the rhetoric of decline. Actually, in many respects, American democracy is showing its finest hour in the last few decades, not its worst hour.
And Jill, what about you? Say, in a way, we have a new kind of issue on the table with life and death themselves, meshing into a political context. What does our history tell us about how we deal with the largest moral issues? I mean, whether it's slavery or suffrage or civil rights and Jim Crow. I mean, does this fall in that tradition, how we will ultimately deal with the issue of life, death, abortion, women's rights?
Well, yeah, I mean to say it's a different emphasis thematically, but I don't mean to say it's wholly different in kind. I mean, I couldn't agree more with the idea that the declensionist narrative is somewhat suspect. I mean, even just to refresh our memory, 10 years ago, this conversation would have been about apathy. Apathy was the key word in our discussion of American politics. What could be more wholly forgotten than the idea that people didn't care enough, right? And yet, the endless media attention given to that question, which is a real question, right? Lack of voter participation among young people is an urgent political concern. Yep. It frankly remains an urgent political concern. We could spend our day talking about political apathy today as well as we could have 10 years ago or 20 years ago. There is a kind of fascination with this moment. But with regard to your question, how do these things get resolved? I mean, the election that I always talk about in a classroom is the election of 1800, right, where we sort of firmly established what Jefferson called in his first inaugural address the right to a contest of opinion. We must have a contest of opinion. We must believe that it is possible to disagree with the people who rule over us, disagree with them profoundly, and yet still belong to the nation state. I'm going to read my Jeffersonian quote, because we had this lovely invocation of Jeffersonian nature of the Humanities Institute. Jefferson's first inaugural address is most best known for these lines: "Having banished from our land that religious intolerance under which mankind so long bled and suffered, we have yet gained little if we countenance a political intolerance as despotic, as wicked, and as capable of as bitter and bloody persecutions." Jefferson's whole argument there, having come through a very difficult, painful, vicious election against John Adams and having prevailed, his point was to say, this is what we can only stand for.
We're talking civility and civil discourse in American history in this session. I want to invite you to come to the microphones now, and we will turn to our audience around the country for their comments and questions. We've got an email here from Kathleen at Claremont Graduate University. This is California. Who says to us, and she's talking here about how different parties, different political persuasions tend to look at civility over time, I guess, right, left, whether there's a tendency on one side or the other. I'll read this, and she says, is there a difference between how contemporary liberalism and conservatism look at civility? She's got more to say, you'll read it here, but let me just put that question first. If we want to look liberal and conservative, these are contemporary classifications. You may find their counterparts in history. Are there different understandings, John, I'll come first to you, of how to look at this issue of civility, how important it is? Is it embraced by one end of the political spectrum in one era and by another in another era?
I think it's a great question. The answer would be whether or not conservatives or liberals are in power and feel threatened by the other, they're going to accuse the other of being uncivil. So slave owners, in the antebellum period, controlled the nation. I mean, they nationalized slavery, and yet they felt defensive because the New World was abolishing slavery. And then there's the rise of abolitionism. They target opponents of slavery as uncivil. And in the 20th century, the liberal establishment, Lionel Trilling has written brilliantly on the liberal tradition and how important that's been, really from FDR through 1980s. And so there was a period in which, liberals, on the one hand, they were fearful of the what Trilling called the adversary tradition, the left, the radicals. Now liberals are fearful of the radical right.
And in the media, Randall, the right has found a very congenial home in talk radio, in talk television. Just by the numbers, the dominance there is quite clear. Does that play a role? Or why do you think that's emerged now at this point in our history? And is that undermining civility, that fierce voice from the right? Is that just in the tradition of fierce opposition of those with the sort of high dudgeon in a political moment?
I think that much of the civility talk is used by liberals and conservatives alike. There's certain lines that people use, and each is perfectly willing to use these different lines. So there came a point where President Obama accused his political adversaries of not being civil enough. Well, the elder Bush gave speeches in which he said his political adversaries were not being civil enough. I see it largely as a football that the politicians often use to their convenience.
Isn't there a reality at the same time, though? I mean, look at American media today. There's a kind of you'd have to describe it just as a measurable imbalance in the presence of fierce voices. Now, you can find voices right across the spectrum, but you look at the radio spectrum, for example, there's a lot more right-wing talk than left-wing talk. Is that just the left whining, or is it something about our new media configuration? I don't know, Jill, what do you think?
Well, I think that our sense of what we have lost with regard to the media is a historical anomaly. Our media has generally been partisan and incredibly fierce. So in the election of 1800, Federalists campaigned against Jefferson with newspaper headline that read, "Vote for Adams and God or Jefferson and no God." I mean, you can't really you can't do more mudslinging than that. I mean, I'd challenge you to find me a negative campaign television ad that's more ferocious than that. I think that we often talk about civility in politics as a way to not talk about money in politics.
Because, expand, please.
Because money in politics is the real problem.
And if it's bought out? So is the conversation about civility then a distraction from something more profound? Is the Is the incivility an outgrowth of money in politics?
No, but I think it is a convenience. We can all agree that it would be nice not to call one another horrible, nasty names in public. This is not a controversial statement.
You lie.
Well, I mean, actually, in my house, we do call each other horrible, nasty names all the time. But we agree with that. There's not like a lot of political capital to spend in making such a statement. I really strongly believe that there should not be campaign donations of the kind and amount that we have now legitimized. To say that in public is to ruin your political career, right? So shouldn't it be easier to say a political truth than a political piece of nonsense?
And perhaps we should be saying that even more fiercely than it's being said today. Here's a Twitter question from Caitlin, where she writes, doesn't saying that we've lost our sense of history imply that we all share the same sense of history in the first place? Randall, how does that come into play here?
No, I don't think so. All I'm saying is that in order to make judgments, it's always a matter of compared to what. So you can't say that things have gotten worse without knowing a good deal about the past. If you're in a society, no matter where you stand ideologically, in order to make sensible and accurate assessments of where we are now, we have to know what's happened before. That's all I was saying.
Let's take a question from right here in the audience in Boston. Sir, thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Nick Mann, and my question was sparked by you, Dr. Kennedy, when you said the words idealism and pragmatism. As a student, I remember somewhere picking up the phrase, the way out of chaos is structure. As an organizational consultant, I often go into organizations that are in chaos or conflict, and the first thing we have to do is figure out some organizing agreements or ground rules. I guess what I'm thinking about is the collision between idealism and the notion of structure and ground rules and organizing agreements, which is more consistent with pragmatism. And just if you have thoughts about that collision.
Very good, thank you. Randall?
Well, I hope this will be at least somewhat responsive to your comment. You know, with respect to structure, one of the most structured places in American life are courtrooms. And courtrooms are very structured, they're quiet. You go into a courtroom right now, in any place all around the country, you go into a courtroom, it's quiet, it's structured, you have the forces of authority to make sure it stays that way. A judge comes in and delivers a punishment. It's all very quiet, all very structured, all very civil. And some of the worst cruelties inflicted in American life happen right there, in these places of structure. And it seems to me in these places that are very civil. And that makes me think that structure, while helpful in many respects, does not at all put to, domesticate the problems that we face.
And yet, in our country, we have so much room for spirited discourse that doesn't require being screwed down into the tight confines of a courtroom. And we do not seem to practice that. Look at the questions being raised on the stage today about inequality, about money in politics. I mean, I think many Americans, and sympathetically to this question, have the feeling that we're retreating to ideological corners rather than pragmatically engaging. And this may be golden ageism, but there's a hunger that has something to do with civil discourse for people across the spectrum to engage and talk these things through in a way that would be pragmatically longing for some solution, some resolution. Is that, in the context of history, John, is that unrealistic to long for that?
It's a great question. There's always been a profound tension mean, as you suggested, between idealism and pragmatism, and that pragmatists always come under the threat of sacrificing their ideals in exchange for negotiation and compromise. And there are certain circumstances, there are certain times, civil rights, abolitionists, I mean, the very notion of immediatism, of refusing to compromise because the gradual go-slow approach isn't working. Mm-hmm. At some point, you need to take a stand. The question is, which of those issues are of the seriousness that requires that stand? For some people today, abortion. You know, if you believe, as Randy suggests, if you believe that abortion is murder, I mean, that is a...
Then it's all over about the shouting. It's all over about the...
At some point, yes.
Jill?
Yeah, I was just going to say with regard to people's felt need, because I think that is genuine and I think it is quite deep. I went to do some sort of town hall talks a couple years ago about the Tea Party movement, and the first one I did, people got up and said sort of really quite extraordinarily fierce and vicious things to one another. And so the next time I went to go do one of these, I delivered some prefatory remarks where I just said, okay, there's strong feelings in this room. Undoubtedly, that's great. We all have everyone here has strong views. Let's just set some ground rules for how we're going to have this conversation. Mm-hmm. And there was this there was this actually palpable, sort of almost physical sense of relief in the room. Everyone was so glad to have some sort of rules of engagement. And then we had an incredibly, you know, every time I did this, we'd have these incredibly dynamic, really heated, ruckus, you know, difficult conversations. But people were sort of, it's very fun. It's sort of like the fun of being in a classroom, right? That's a wonderful place for modeling and how to actually disagree. So I think that people really want to have more fora to do that. That people are eager to step up and participate in a forum where it's possible to disagree very passionately, very deeply, and even in some cases where necessary to wholly disregard other people's opinions where they conflict with some deep and often, you know, religious and existential beliefs. But there aren't that many places in American political life where that happens, and our politicians don't model that for us.
They don't model it. Our media doesn't model it very often. Sir.
First, I want to thank the people who created this and for your comments this morning, the people on the panel. But I must say, except for the last remark, I was very, very disturbed at a kind of minimizing distinctions and not bringing clarity to the notion of means and ends. Certainly, something about abolition is a position that people can feel passionate about, but it's how that passion is brought into the public. We have good models in Martin Luther King and in Mahatma Gandhi of people taking a stand, making a ruckus, all the other things that were given here as a kind of permission to be uncivil. But their disobedience was civil. It was civil disobedience. And that is a position where people are taking on themselves a certain cost in order to remain civil, rather than just giving themselves free rein to do, for instance, as 2 years ago, interrupt all the town halls that were going to take place between us, local voters and citizens, and our elected congressmen, because people came in who didn't want us to talk about the health care bill, which was going to affect all of us. Mm-hmm. There are distinctions that can be made, and I'd like to hear from the panel on that.
This is a great question, especially for a history panel. Is it not possible that as Americans, with our particular history, with our Civil War, with our bouts of violence, that in some ways we need to move forward in our civil discourse. We need to unshackle from history, take up the model of Martin Luther King, take up Gandhi, if you will. Maybe history is the wrong guide for us here. Maybe we can get caught up in, you know, the same way people get caught up in the glory of the founders. Maybe we need a more evolutionary attitude toward how we resolve our problems in this country, with our history, with our culture. John.
It's a great idea, an evolutionary model. I think, though, an evolutionary model should still be constructed based on the past. And I think the question in terms of means and ends is an excellent one. One of the things that's really interesting in history and civil rights and in abolitionism is the degree to which nonviolent direct action, depending on circumstance, gives way at various points to the acceptance under extreme conditions of violence. I mean, if you know, on the one hand, there is the straight pacifist view. During the Civil War, especially after the Civil War becomes a war to end slavery, Quakers, who were the most pacifist groups, pacifism was central to Quakerism. There were thousands of Quakers who joined the Union Army and fought as soldiers because they had to make a choice between their principle of nonviolence as Quakers and their hatred of slavery, which depended upon violence.
But how about at town hall meetings? Where is that? Is that a battlefront nowadays?
No, that was to a degree a battlefront. I think that you're right. I think that in terms of taking over, it really didn't manifest itself so in terms of taking over the town halls. In what way would they take over? I think that, my understanding is that that's breaking the law to a certain degree, and it didn't come to fruition. And I don't know the degree to which that was a threat rather than an act to really realize that aim. I'm not as familiar with that specific, the details of that example.
If I may, Randall Kennedy, you hold up William Lloyd Garrison. Our audience companion holds up Martin Luther King. Mm-hmm. These are two different ways. What about the lessons of history from these two, and should we see them as points on an arc toward a more civil discourse or not?
Listen, my answer to all these questions is as follows. It all depends. To take, for instance, on the Twitter, someone's asking the Twitter, Joe Wilson. A lot of people, South Carolinian, I was against Joe Wilson standing up and saying, "You lie."
In the State of the Union address.
In the State, in the joint session of Congress. Yeah. But I say that with a qualification. Just suppose the President of the United States had been saying something that I viewed as completely reprehensible. Just suppose the President of the United States was, let's say, Andrew Jackson, talking about how great it was to remove the Indians.
Cherokee. Mm-hmm.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Would I have then objected if someone stood up and said, "This is terrible," and had disrupted the President of the United States and had shown disrespect for the presidency? No, I would have applauded that person. It all depends, frankly, on the context in which we're talking about.
But it's not always those moments of highest passion or when all the Klieg lights are on. There are so many conversations that go on, all the way down to humble and very important town hall meetings. And our forgive me, but our colleague in the audience here says, what about the Gandhian model? What about Martin Luther King's model? Can't we move toward that? Maybe that's a kind of, maybe those models are begging us to embrace a more civil discourse in this country. As we become more populous, or as we become more diverse, as our issues maybe become more complex, maybe we need to move more deliberately toward those models.
It's also the understanding of morality underneath those models, that we don't need to disrespect our opponent in order to speak to them and in order to engage them so that they can listen and we can listen. It's more complex than just the forms of Gandhi and Martin Luther King.
Jill, is it always the okay corral in this country?
Well, I think it's important to remember that the Tea Party movement and the Occupy movement, I think, quite self-consciously see themselves in that tradition. I mean, this is why Glenn Beck held his rally in D.C. on Martin Luther King Day. So you may disagree with the one or both, or most people agree with one of those movements and not the other, but I'm not sure why you dismiss them as models of this kind of action. Or do you?
But it was the Tea Party who disrupted the town halls. But I should give room to other speakers.
Point taken. Please.
When you say that politics cannot answer the existential questions that are at the heart of all these political matters we discuss, why is it, in your view, that it's impossible for politics to address the existential questions? Do you think that perhaps if there was more of an acknowledgement of the existential matters at the heart of political discourse, that politics could be more effective at addressing them? Or do you think there's just something about the nature of politics that makes it impossible to address the existential questions?
Thank you. Jill.
Yeah, thanks for that really thoughtful question. I guess I would say to think about the Constitutional Convention and the degree to which the framers of the Constitution considered themselves engaged not in an act of revolution, but in an act of political reformation, akin to the Protestant Reformation. So that when Franklin stood up on that final day on September 17, 1787, to urge the delegates to sign, several of them had already left in protest, a lot of people didn't want to sign. And he said, I don't know that this document is perfect, because we are all infallible. And Frank, with his famous sense of humor, said, the only difference between the Church of England and the Church of Rome is that the former is infallible and the latter is never wrong. This was Franklin's great insight about politics. If we believe if we believe absolutely in our own ideas and in the infallibility of our own ideas, and this is again Jefferson's remark in the first inaugural address, we will arrive at a kind of bloody and bitter persecution that condemned humankind to centuries of slaughter over wars of religion. So we need to be careful about what we bring into the sphere of politics, or at least if you believe in those founding documents, and if you care about the political ideals from the 18th century and how much or how little we regard those with a genre true is a decision that we each make as citizens. But I would say that in the spirit of the kind of political reformation that the founding of this country was part of, we cannot afford to turn to politics for our sources of religious authority.
But how can it be left out? I mean,
it's driving our politics.
You make it seem as though the issues that you focus on, the life issues, can be outside of the realm of politics. But how can that be? I mean,
well, they are not.
No, they can't be.
Right. Okay.
They can't be.
But I thought that's what you were arguing. I thought that your complaint was I thought that you were complaining about the politicization of these. It seemed to me they are politicized. They're part of our politics. There's no way out. Politics is all around us.
To be part of our politics is different than to be being defined by partisanship.
Is it possible that with these issues that may be irresolvable, that civil discourse is the way we live along as we fail to resolve because they're irresolvable? That it's the sort of medium that lets us live together and keep sort of talking and talking and talking things through rather than coming to blows? Is that some value, or is that dodging the fundamental issue? I mean, we haven't been able to resolve it. You raise life and choice, and there it stands for years. If the choice is to talk and talk and talk and talk it over, or go to war over it, maybe that's a reason in itself to uphold civil discourse.
Messy as it might be.
Messy as unsatisfying,
it might
ultimately,
yes.
if it keeps us away, if it helps us act on what we've learned about the cost of violence.
Yes, I agree with that. Although I wouldn't say that you throw away the gun. That there are certain instances, and again, it completely depends on context, but the longer you can sustain civil discourse, messy as it might get, the better off you are, and the greater likelihood there is for some sort of solution.
From around the country, Helen emails us and she asks, are there more out-and-out lies being bandied about in political discourse these days? I guess this is a good one against the backdrop of history too. What about it? The factual content of what constitutes our discourse these days. More or less true than against American history?
When Jefferson was elected, he allowed the Sedition Act to expire. He was so opposed to the Sedition Act that had been put in place in part to prevent him from coming to office. And then within 6 months of his election, he writes a letter in which he says the problem with the newspapers is we could divide them into 4 sections. We could call the first one truth, the second one probabilities, the third one possibilities, and the fourth section lies. And that's really all there is in the newspapers. I don't think there is actually, with regard to the media, again, this sort of period...
Media or politicians, their own discourse and the factual content of it.
I think we tend to celebrate as a golden age, a period of consensus that we associate with the Cold War that came at great cost to dissent.
Right. Sir.
There seems to be a useful consensus about context and boundaries and when civility is called for and when it might be excused if it isn't. And we've even had some categories of liberty, slavery, and definition of life and death as being reasons where perhaps we don't have to be as civil when we discuss some of those deep issues. But can any of the panelists explain how, in heaven's name, the size of government crosses that boundary? Because that seems to be the debate today.
Yes? We'll take that on. That seems thoroughly contemporary.
It's a great question. I think it's actually less the size of government and more the structure of the media by which civil discourse is propagated. So I completely agree with Jill about the connection between money and politics, and why that interferes with civil discourse is because it creates structures that impedes a healthy debate. When you have hundreds of millions of dollars creating PACs and establishing monologues, shrill monologues that if not destroys, it impedes this kind of vibrant, messy political arena. And I think that has less to do with the size of the government than the structure of the most visible form of media that would perpetuate civil discourse.
Jill, you raise money in politics as a big underlying issue. And here's the issue of super PACs and all the reams of literature and sound bites that they can create. Is it possible that it is money itself is substituting its voice for an actual deeper discourse, civil discourse or otherwise, that it may be inhibiting us, again, against the backdrop of history, more today than in the past, from realizing an effective national conversation to take on some of the issues that we're confronted with today?
Well, I think that money in politics is responsible for the tremendous party discipline in Congress, for instance, which is a historical novelty. We've not had this degree of party discipline in the 20th century or at any point. It's just lockstep votes. I think it's very difficult. You know, who would want to be a politician and have to be answerable to that, to never be able to vote in accordance with the desires of your constituents or with your own standards and beliefs and values, but to only vote with your party? I think that is a consequence of money in politics, an incredibly pernicious consequence. And it has to do, I think, it contributes to the absolutism and the sort of discourse of absolutism. So with regard to the size of government, which is a great question, like, shouldn't that be something we could talk about civilly? It seems like there's room for a lot of reasonable positions we could have about that. But again, the sort of style, the political style of I'm good, you're evil. And that's really the only.
And if you lock it into a question of liberty beneath, which is often done. To wrap up, let's think just for a moment about how those that you all know well from history might look at our moment now. I mean, cast your mind back. If someone, some frock-coated gentleman, or, you know, Constitution-burning William Lloyd Garrison, or, you know, Richard Hofstadter, if he could join us again here today, survey this American milieu today from a great height, you know, listen in to us for a few months and sort of take the measure of it. John, what do you think? Pick your figure, pick your time. What do you think they would think of where we stand now, our discourse today?
I'll pick Frederick Douglass. How would Frederick Douglass view our current moment? He would want an even greater expansion of civil discourse, meaning it would be messier because of the profound silences that exist about, to a certain degree, money in politics, but especially the mass incarceration rate, which is another form, he would see it, I think, as another form of slavery. After all, the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, makes an exception for convicted criminals.
So talk about that.
Yes, to talk about that issue. And among developed nations, the United States is off the cliff, off the charts in terms of its mass incarceration. That is, no one is really discussing that in terms of the political discourse.
Randall Kennedy, pick a perspective, a person.
I think that we could canvass our history, bring back any person you'd want, and my comment would be that in many respects, we live actually in a time of more accountability. There is the press, you know, when John F. Kennedy was in the White House, there were whole subjects that were not explored. There were all sorts of questions that were not asked. That's not the case today. People bring up all sorts of things. There are more voices. There's more political participation from wider sectors of the American populace.
The blue dress is waved.
So, well, yes. You know, I mean, there's also an opening for, you know, ridiculousness and more, you know, and distraction. I'm not saying that all that comes to the fore is good. There's a lot of ridiculousness that comes to the fore. I guess I am saying that we should, in my view, cut out the apocalyptic notions that, you know, we are worse off than we've ever been. In many respects, we're better off than we've ever been, including in terms of the way in which people participate in politics and, frankly, understand politics.
Jill Lepore, pick a perspective from the past, from the mists of time.
Well, Benjamin Franklin always said he wished that he could be preserved in a vat of Madeira wine so that he could come and see what the country was like in 2 centuries. But I am a pretty strong believer that the past is behind us and the dead are dead, and this is our world to make.
And this is our world to make. Never mind what they might think of it, it's ours right now.
They can't speak to us in that way.
So let's pick it and take the bit in our teeth and run with it. We will do that today. I'm very grateful to the three of you for getting us started with the perspective of history. John Stauffer, Randall Kennedy, Jill Lepore, thank you very much. Thank you very much. We'll take a short break and be back.
Civility and American Democracy, a national forum, has been brought to you by UMass Boston, in partnership with Mass Humanities, 90.9 WBUR, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the University of Alaska, the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, Claremont Graduate University, the Evans School of Public Policy at the University of Washington, the Goldfarb Center for Public Affairs and Civic Engagement at Colby College, the National Institute for Civil Discourse at the University of Arizona, the New Hampshire Institute of Politics at St. Anselm College, the Robert F. Wagner School of Public Service at New York University, and the School of Public Affairs at Arizona State University.